Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this meeting of the Housing and Community Safety Policy and Scrutiny Committee. This is our first public meeting since, I think it was February. We've had a number of informal meetings, but today's meeting is a formal webcast meeting, so welcome everybody. I'll begin with any declarations of interest. Do any members have any interest to declare? No, not seeing any hands. In terms of the way we'll organise a meeting, as many members will be aware, if you want to contribute, please raise your blue hand. So that's in the participants bar at the bottom of the screen. And click on your little blue hand, and I'll be able to see it on screen. Similarly, if any officers want to say something, please click on your blue hand also. If someone asks a question and you'd like to ask a supplementary question, if you please raise your physical hand, then I'll know to bring you in on that. So I think those are our housekeeping rules. And if you're not speaking, please stay on mute. Any apologies for absence? Councillor Pavlovic.
Councillor Wells, Chair.
Okay, thank you for that. I am expecting Councillor Vassi, although he's not here, so hopefully he will appear, but if not, we'll note his apologies. Agenda item 2 is the minutes of the last meeting, the last public meeting, which was held on the 24th of February. If you can cast your minds that far back. Do any members have any matters of accuracy in the minutes? No. As far as I can recall, it is an accurate record of the meeting. In terms of matters arising, we had a discussion on environmental retrofitting back at our February meeting, and just to know that may be something that is coming around again on our forward work plan. So with just that noted, members' consent for me to sign those minutes off. Yeah, great. Thank you very much. Agenda item 3 is public participation. We have no registrations from members of the public to speak. Agenda item 4, community safety during COVID. So thank you to the officers who have come along this evening to participate in this discussion. I think the prompt for this item being suggested was really a recognition that a lot has happened over the last 7 or 8 months, and a lot more is yet to come. But there's been quite a lot of attention, particularly during the early phases of the first lockdown, on enforcement in all of its guises, really. So enforcement in response to various manifestations of antisocial behaviour from an environmental perspective, from a housing perspective, from a criminal damage perspective, and there's also been the added complexity of enforcement of COVID-related restrictions, and it is it's a complex area, and I think from the point of view of members and of members of the public, it's not always easy to understand where responsibility rests, how the various agencies that are involved coordinate their resource and prioritise their limited resources. So I think this will hopefully be an opportunity for us as members to learn more, and for members of the public to have an insight into how the council and its partners are approaching this issue in what have been very, very challenging times and continue to be. What I'd like to try and get from the discussion, as well as a better understanding of what we're doing, how we're prioritising, is really to get a sense of how members and how everyone in York can play their part in terms of working with and supporting the council and the police and other partners in sort of encouraging and promoting responsible behaviour, and knowing who to turn to when people do have concerns that they feel need to be addressed. I think it's something that certainly in the course of the last few months I've learned a lot in terms of as issues have come up, wondering who's responsible for what exactly, and I think that would be something useful for us to have, but also to figure out going forward how we can all play a constructive role. So what I'd like to do is invite Jane Mowat and Matthew Boxall from the council and Dennis Southall to say a few words about the challenges that they and their teams have faced since March, their current priorities, and looking ahead to an uncertain future, what future priorities will be. I'm very grateful for Superintendent Lindsay Butterfield for joining us this evening. Lindsay's the area commander for York and Selby, and I'm really looking forward to hearing Lindsay's views and sharing some of her experiences and kind of hopes and asks really going forward as to how we can best work together. So thank you, Lindsay, for taking the time out. So if I ask Jane, then Matt, then Dennis and Lindsay, would that be the best order to take it in? If I'll ask Jane, if you want to kick us off, please, if that's okay.
Yeah, that's absolutely fine. So I mean, obviously, this is a first for community safety in trying to deliver services through a pandemic. I'll start really with the challenges that we've faced since lockdown was announced on the 23rd of March. So looking at antisocial behaviour then, with the courts closed, obviously our enforcement activity ground to an almost immediate halt. Early on in the lockdown process, we brought into place a procedure working with our colleagues in North Yorkshire Police, because obviously the community safety team is made up not just of council staff, but also we have police officers working in the team as well. So we put a procedure in place where we started to contact people who we became aware of through police reported incidents had breached the lockdown rules, so that we could provide a joint approach, a united front in terms of impressing on people the importance of adhering to the advice that they were being given, and to work with us really to make sure that we tried to keep the infection rate as much under control as we possibly could. Over time, we started to bring back services as and when we could make them safe. So lots of consideration around risk assessments, and that's not just in relation to the staff, it's also in relation to the community and the impact that bringing services back in the way that we would normally deliver them would potentially have on those communities. As I mentioned, the courts were closed, so that meant no enforcement action could take place, but that didn't mean that we wouldn't still be gathering the evidence to take things through to prosecution as and when the courts reopened. So a continued process of messaging went on during those early times, urging people to still continue to report things, particularly using the 101 system. And I'm sure Lindsay will talk about the importance of that later on when she speaks about the police perspective, but really urging people to continue to report things so that we could continue gathering that evidence and building the picture that enables us to then take things through to a prosecution if that's the course of action that we're taking. However, it also gave us the opportunity to look at innovative ways, because with the closure of the courts and enforcement action not being available to us, we had to look at other ways of dealing with problems, working with our partners, and really pulling together everybody's united effort in trying to tackle some of the problems that were going on across the city and continued to go on, even though we were in lockdown and then gradually those restrictions were eased. Some of that has involved the introduction of technology. So for instance, in relation to dealing with noise nuisance, we've brought in the use of the Noise Aid app and the use of smartphone recording of noise incidents, so that residents can record what's happening and submit that directly to us, to still be able to take action as we would normally do if we were to witness that sound or noise nuisance ourselves. The benefit of that has meant that we've been able to operate an on-call service over 7 days of the week. So we've been able to use that for our ongoing and our serious noise cases so that we could deal with them quick time. And we've also continued to install noise recording equipment into properties by delivering it to people's front doors, collecting it and then sanitizing it appropriately before it's redeployed again. We've continued to have our fortnightly intelligence meetings with the police intelligence unit, again, to make sure that we're really focusing on the most disruptive offenders and that we're also keeping a monitoring eye on county lines activity as well. So that's in relation to sort of how we've been dealing with ASB and the process sort of during lockdown and then gradually as we came out of it. Domestic abuse caused us quite a significant challenge. The initial concerns about what lockdown would be like for those people who are victims of domestic abuse and how we could work together to support them. We pulled together almost immediately a weekly tactical meeting. So that involved myself from City of York Council, my counterpart in the County Council, the Office of the Police Fire and Crime Commissioner and North Yorkshire Police, so that we could monitor resources, look at what the figures were telling us and make sure that service provision was adequate to meet demand. And that included monitoring the refuge spaces and making sure that we got adequate refuge provision across the county and the city. We also were concerned fairly early on in lockdown as figures in the national news showed that the number of contacts to the national domestic abuse helplines had increased significantly, and that wasn't being reflected at the time in the figures that we were seeing with our local support services. However, when we started to drill more deeply into the data, we could see that a lot of the contacts that were being made were actually being made by professionals looking for advice on what services were still being provided rather than from victims. We put a massive amount of effort into promoting the local services, and that included getting local information into the COVID testing centres. Initially when they were first established, they were promoting the national helpline. We felt that having that local information would be much better. And we've also run some Microsoft Teams based social media sessions highlighting the work that's going on between the partners to look at domestic abuse, but also providing some themed information around some of the key behaviours and how to seek advice and support if victims need to do that. The next sort of challenge that came for us really was when the hospitality industry opened at the beginning of July. Again, we were very mindful of the importance of getting the economy up and running, and we wanted to see that. But we did have an issue towards the end of June where we saw quite a significant increase in people drinking in Tower Gardens in the city centre, and we were concerned about the antisocial behaviour that might take place when the hospitality industry reopened. And some of that was around concern about the impact of lockdown on people's lives and the fact that, you know, people were going to come out of this back into the pubs, and as we know, the mix of alcohol is a problem in its own right, without bringing into it the effects of having been confined to home for such a long period of time. We've worked closely with Public Realm, we've worked with the Public Protection and Licensing team and also the Economic Development team to make sure that we'd put good measures in place to support the hospitality industry and provide information around safety and the guidance that we wanted them to adhere to. And we've also ensured within that we put out messages around counter-terrorism safety, so that we were supporting the hospitality industry as they reopened to ensure that they were making their premises as safe as possible for their staff and customers. We then hit a bit of an issue towards the end of September around busking and the fact that buskers can draw big crowds, and if big crowds don't socially distance, and you've add alcohol in the mix, and obviously that brings with it issues too. But again, reacted very, very quickly, working with our colleagues in the city neighbourhood policing team to run joint initiatives with our colleagues in public protection again, and I'm sure Matt will refer to this, to work with the licensees, to work with the buskers and Make It York, and also to promote those messages around social distancing. So in terms then of the opportunities that have come out of this, because I think, you know, although it's felt at times very, very challenging, I do think there are some things that have come out of it which have been really, really beneficial. The use of technology and using the Noise Aid app and encouraging residents to record noise using their mobile phone is a good step forward, because it provides the opportunity for them to submit things much more quickly to us. We've also engaged with the voluntary sector, so we've now got a member of the Ways to Wellbeing team working within the community safety team, linking in with our officers to ensure that victims and perpetrators of antisocial behaviour who've got complex needs are getting support through the voluntary sector, and that's a really positive step forward. We've also, because we've had to look at innovative ways of dealing with antisocial behaviour because we couldn't take enforcement action, I think it's provided an opportunity for us to build on that. So looking more closely at an early intervention and prevention approach, and also on making sure that we're continuing to link in with our partners and that we're delivering a holistic approach to problem solving and not just looking at enforcement as the only course of action. We've opted to continue with the tactical domestic abuse meetings, and we will continue to do that. We've got no plans to stop that process from continuing until such time as we feel that service provision and indeed the situation has returned to much more normal levels. And I think as well, it's also given us the opportunity to really test out the virtual platforms for meetings. That's rationalised meetings, but I think the most important thing is it's enabled us to bring partners together much more quickly than we would normally be doing if we were trying to organise a meeting face to face. So there's been some huge benefits there, and certainly where meetings take place, as they quite often do in community safety across the city and the county, it's really reduced officer travelling time, so it's made sure that we've been able to address things much more quickly and efficiently. In terms of the current priorities, well, obviously we're moving from Thursday into another period of lockdown. Our priority, I think, is absolutely to continue to reduce the rate of infection, to support our communities, and also to preserve the economy by working with our partners, both in public health and the police, to ensure that the rules are being adhered to. And I think that's really important, particularly as we head towards what hopefully might be a slight respite for Christmas at least. Matt and myself have been working to look at COVID marshals. So we're looking at procuring some COVID support marshals, getting those in place to support us. And we've had lots of talks about what that would mean, you know, as we were in tier 2. And then obviously moving into lockdown and making sure that we've got a deployable resource that we can move across the city to each location that requires it, depending on what the situation is. And that's something that we'll continue to monitor closely and be working on. And I think it's important to note as well that COVID marshals don't have an enforcement power, but they're there to engage, to educate, to encourage people to change their behaviour and to help us to keep that infection rate right down. We'll continue to implement the work that we did at the start of lockdown by working with North Yorkshire Police in terms of sending out letters again to those who have breached the COVID regs and putting in place that escalation to enforcement if we need to, but again, focusing very much on engagement, education and encouragement. We'll also, I'm looking at bringing back the full weekend noise patrols to pick up noise reports so that we're able to deal with those much better than we did in the first lockdown. In the first lockdown, we were struggling with how to get the service delivered in a safe way. We've got all of that covered now with staff with full access to PPE. So we are in a position to be able to operate that service again now. And also, I think from my perspective, from the work that we deliver within the community safety team and the cases that we deal with, really focusing in on that impact of lockdown and how that impacts on people's mental health, on the tolerance levels of people, because as we're locked down again, we become more aware of noise and things that are going on around us, and how that impacts on behaviour. And also, again, once more, putting that focus on domestic abuse and the resources to tackle it. I think as well, we need to be focusing very much on what happens after Christmas, because as we know, this year since March has absolutely flown by. So we will be back into spring, good weather, and all that brings before we know it. So I think making sure that we've got those robust plans in place to make sure that we're able to look at things like the opening up of the hospitality industry again, and what that looks like in terms of our open spaces and how we manage those going forward. And then, of course, monitoring services and resources as we go forward and adapting to the circumstances, particularly as we don't know yet exactly what's going to happen in relation to the courts and what that might look like. So that's given you a bit of a whistle stop tour. So I'll stop there and pause for anyone to ask any questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Jane. And I I omitted to formally introduce you. You're the head of community safety at City of York Council, so apologies for that. Any sort of questions or observations members have, if you kind of hold the thought, and then we'll hear from everybody, and then we'll come back together and give everything a good airing. Thank you very much for that, Jane. Can I bring in Matt Boxall at this point? Matt is the head of public protection, City of York Council. Matt, is there anything you'd like to add to what Jane has set out in terms of your area of operation over the last few months?
Yeah, I'll thank you, Joe. I'll just touch on a few of the things that our team is dealing with. For those of you not familiar with public protection, that's the environmental health trading standards and licensing arm of the council, and those regulatory functions. And as Jane's alluded to, we've been working with Jane, been working with Lindsay and her police officers throughout this, and public health have been a key partner as well. And that's been, something that's really blossomed out of this pandemic is our day-to-day working relationship with them. We've been taking the lead on the business-facing element of the COVID response. In the early days, so March, April, it was all about ensuring businesses that had to close were closed. So that was hospitality and non-essential retail. Now, of course, for York's economy, that's a large swathe of it. Because York's appeal is about eating, drinking and shopping, isn't it, by and large. So a lot of businesses did have to close. But of course, there was the message that if you could stay open, you should stay open, by and large for businesses. And we were receiving in the early days a lot of complaints about that, I suppose, that tension there between people who thought that businesses should be closed and weren't closed, and why weren't they closed? Weren't really selling essential goods, but they might have been further up the supply chain. We had a lot of complaints from employees and family members of employees who thought that it wasn't safe to be at work or weren't comfortable at being at work. And especially when others, perhaps in similar industries, even might have been off. And we had complaints from competitors about other businesses remaining open. So there are lots of complaints coming in. And these were very difficult conversations to have, because obviously the businesses that were open lawfully and were doing their best to remain open safely in order to keep trading, keep viable. And they were really difficult tensions that our officers had to tread that line between. But we did that. In the end, we only had 3 businesses which we were required to close down, which I thought was pretty good, really, considering there's over 2,000 retailers and hospitality businesses on our system alone. So that's a very, very low percentage. So compliance was good. Let's not get away from that. Then over the summer, as Jane says, businesses reopened. It brought about new challenges. The city centre started to pick up a lot. I know it never quite got back to full footfall, but not not a million miles from it. It was very encouraging. We had the Eat Out to Help Out scheme that kept the city busy throughout the year. There's the relay or throughout the week. Relaxation of the licensing laws, of course, so everyone could now. Everyone who had an on license now had an off license, and there were lots of applications for cafe licenses as well. Event organisers began to want to put events back on, which was meaning that there were, the city was felt like it was beginning perhaps to come back to a bit more like normal, perhaps. And all of this was okay, providing businesses were COVID secure, and officers spent a lot of time advising businesses on how to be COVID secure, and often that was very detailed advice. Complaints sort of changed then about new things. People not social distancing in premises, not wearing face coverings became the sort of nature of the complaints. People not keeping track and trace details when that came in. So the biggest challenge was that legislation was tricky, and it kept changing, kept coming in thick and fast. And we started with some Let's Be York guidance, which was all this legislation in one place that businesses could go to as like a one-stop shop for all their help. And it had things like, all the health and safety requirements you had to comply with, plus there was signage that you could download, and there was advice on how to deal with queuing, particularly in certain streets around the city where queuing might be more challenging. And that was really, really helpful advice in that early stage of opening up, and that was well received. Of course, as time goes on, the legislation keeps changing. It's harder and harder to keep on top of that particular piece of work. So we've moved now towards going back to the generic advice that the government gives, although we've managed to keep some of the best bits of that still online, so it's still a helpful tool. But that's been the biggest challenge, I think, the pace of change of the legislation. I mean, you've only got to take this month, for example. We started off just a few weeks ago where we had the national legislation which was lots of individual piece of legislation saying you can do this, you can't do that, etc., etc. Then we moved over to the tiered legislation, and we started off in the medium risk, and then very quickly moved into the higher risk. So that was another set of legislation, and now just we're going to go on to the lockdown. So the legislation, I've never known anything like it in terms of pace of change of legislation, and trying to keep on top of that. And of course, we get the information the same time as everybody else gets the information, and yet we're being asked to interpret it as to what it means. And it can be, it's sometimes the case, it's only a couple of days later that the guidance comes out, but that guidance feels like forever if you're a business trying to interpret it at speed. So that, I think, is one of the biggest challenges we're facing. What next? Well, obviously the lockdown's coming that we all know of. I do think this time, because we've been through it once, we're much better prepared. We're now all working from a practical point. We're now all working from home. We know what the legislation looks like. We've got a sense of how to encourage businesses to comply, and that's brilliant, given, as Jane's already alluded to, that the courts are shut ultimately. So we've got to find ways to persuade people to comply. And as I say, by and large, that's very successful. Really excited that, as Jane alluded to, about the prospect of the COVID support marshals coming in, because that they can really just nudge people into compliance and help people keep their distance. They can do other useful things, like be very visible presence around the city. You know, even cleaning off the buttons on the pedestrian crosses, cleaning the bike racks as they go, giving out helpful advice and information to people about keeping distance and keeping their face coverings on. So yeah, I think that's our biggest opportunity coming our way. And the place to report stuff to, if you've got issues with a business, is public.protection@york.gov.uk.
Okay, thank you for that whistle-stop tour, Matt. If I can now introduce Dennis Southall, who's the Council's Head of Housing. Dennis, and if you can share your sort of experiences and observations from enforcement from a housing perspective. Thank you.
Yes, evening everyone. I'm going to concentrate on council housing tenancies. That's okay, but if there are any other questions across housing, that's absolutely fine. Really wanted to reiterate some of the points that have already been made. The full lockdown obviously saw services come to a bit of a halt as we all quickly adjusted. Services were mobilised incredibly quickly, considering, and the focus was on supporting the most vulnerable in our people who use our services. One of the things that housing management did was make mobilise themselves to make welfare calls to the most vulnerable people. And making sure that they got the help that they needed, making use of the community hubs that were available, food banks, food parcels, and getting the support. We got quite a number of volunteers working one-to-one with some people who needed some help under the full lockdown. I think overall the emphasis has been around what I would call a softer approach. So that's making sure that people are as well informed as possible, and getting help to people, information to them, taking account of the mental health issues that have been identified, some of the frustrations that lockdown brings, the inability to get out, get about, do day-to-day things that everybody were used to. And I think it's safe to say that all of those things exacerbate existing tensions that exist. And as Jane mentioned, increased anxiety and levels of around domestic violence and abuse. Some people took it as an opportunity to be as a snooper's charter, only too willing to report their neighbours for the slightest alleged breach of the regulations, which has been interesting to deal with, led to some difficult discussions between parties, accusing and denying those. And obviously what we do is talk with people about what the regulations are and what they can do, and ways that they can tap into the help that's available to them. Like everybody else, we've made great leaps and bounds with the technology, which has helped us adopt a 3-stage approach to service delivery. So we've used applications such as Attend Anywhere and Remote Assist. We have had some technical difficulties with them, but we're working through those, and they should be fixed over the next few days. Again, the emphasis on those soft skills and working in partnership to resolve issues. So trying to de-escalate things, and obviously working with the community safety units and the police on some of the more serious events that have happened, and including organisations like probation, and referring people through the single access point to get the right support that they need to do that. Obviously, the courts not being available, as has been mentioned, has been an issue. We've had examples of some repeated serious breaches of criminal and civil legislation, and the courts are sending people back home. They're not locking them up for any length of time because of the overall situation, which poses difficulties for communities, and managing those difficult situations. Some of the responses we've used tailored letters. I think Jane mentioned some of those, but also using discretion that we have under the allocations policy. So using what we call direct lets. So where it was deemed appropriate in a situation to move somebody very quickly, we have the ability to do that under the allocations policy. And that's focused on people with multiple complex needs who are quite obviously suffering because of the COVID situation, and making sure that they're looked after as best they can be, and moved out of really difficult situations when that's absolutely needed. And I think the sort of changing legislation, keeping on top of that, making sure that we get the appropriate communications out. And that's been everything from the social media to articles in Streets Ahead around the regulations and how to look after yourself, but also through the letters and some bespoke communications to places like independent living communities, formerly known as sheltered schemes. Developing the hotspot strategy for where we've got a cluster of serious issues going on, and I think that's been effective where it's been applied. So that's about a range of services coming together and having a bit of a strategic approach to dealing with some of the issues in the area. And we've had unfortunately a number of examples like that over the last five or 6 months. The opportunities, I think, to make more use of the technology that we've got to make sure people are able to access services. We were hoping to open up some of our community-based offices over the next few weeks, but that's obviously being put back. But with some of the technology that we use, which is similar to the NHS technology, where people can make appointments and wait in the lobby and be accepted in, and staff can set up advice sessions and things like that and advertise them. We're going to make use of that, or continued use of that, over the coming period. And again, I think the priority is to continue to give positive, clear messaging around lockdown requirements, and making sure that those are reinforced. And where there are difficulties, getting the right support to people in whatever way we can. And just to emphasize that we've worked with teams like the local area coordinators and the local area teams and on children's services to make sure that people are as appropriately supported as possible. I think for the future, I'm very, very conscious, and again, I think there's a touch on it, of the long-term impact on people of COVID restrictions, and as well as financial implications that are becoming ever more exacerbated as time goes on. So we're dealing with some people in some real financial difficulties, and try and help them navigate their way through the schemes and the support and the financial help that exists. And obviously we've not been in a position to enforce from that perspective, so we've tried to emphasize the need to pay the rent where people can do, and getting the help that's appropriate to them when they're struggling to do that. Hopefully that gives you a good idea of what we've been doing in housing.
Yeah. No, thank you, Dennis. I know you've been coming along to our informal sessions and keeping us updated, and that's very much appreciated. Thank you for that. So last but by no means least, Lindsay, to share your thoughts on what I'm sure has been a very interesting past few months, be really good to hear your perspective as to how it's sort of changed what you do and the kind of challenges you've been facing. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. So I think if we go right back to the start of the initial lockdown, then back in March, we established protocols very quickly with councils in terms of who would be responsible and for what. And picking up on Matt's point already, Matt and his team very much focused on the business premises, enabling police service to deal with individuals, residential premises and any gatherings. And right at the beginning of the initial lockdown, we saw a significant reduction in calls for service and in our demand, which enabled my resources to focus on high-risk locations, to patrol areas where we knew people had continued to gather, and to really explain and advise the implications of lockdown and what that meant for the public. I'm sure members will have also seen that we introduced some mobile engagement points whereby we were stopping vehicles and engaging with drivers to establish whether they were on essential journeys or not, again with the intention to educate, engage and advise around the restrictions. As we eased out of lockdown, we very quickly saw an increase in our business as usual demand, and then that became particularly challenging when it was overlaid with that additional layer of COVID related demand as well. So be that people reporting breaches or a whole host of other issues, we actually saw an increase in calls for service significantly to policing. Every call for service is triaged. I think to pick up on your point at the start, Chair, in terms of how do people report, it would be using the 101 system. It is fair to say we don't have sufficient resources to respond to every call there and then, so we have to triage those calls for service, and we will, wherever possible, attend in person to the most significant issues. Failing that, we will pick up, as Jane has already outlined, in terms of that partnership approach by writing letters to homeowners, for example, again, with the intention of engaging and advising, right through to enforcement if that's necessary, but it is very much a partnership approach within the City of York. I think picking up on Matt's point that he's alluded to already, one of the key challenges for myself and my service has been the legislation in terms of how many times it's changed and how quickly it's changed. We've gone from full lockdown to easing of the restrictions to a tiered process and now back into another lockdown. So significant challenges in terms of interpretation of that legislation and having to respond very quickly in terms of what that means and the implications for policing across North Yorkshire. And we know from engaging with the public that that has been and continues to be difficult for people to understand. So we have used what's been called the 4 E's model, which focuses on engagement in the first instance, being able to explain the current restrictions and what that means for the public, encouraging them to adhere to the current restrictions legislation, and then using enforcement as our last resort. I think it's really important to understand that the regulations were brought into effect to prevent the spread of the virus, and enforcement on its own will not do that with the best will in the world. So we have to take that engagement and education approach in the first instance to try and support the public health messaging, protect the NHS, and absolutely engagement is key within all of that. That doesn't mean we won't enforce when it's necessary, and I've brought some statistics this evening just to illustrate where we're at. So for York, we have issued 189 notices to individuals for breach of the regulations. 157 out of the 189 were actually to people that were resident within the city. And I think that's quite an interesting statistic. So that's just 32 of the notices issued were actually visitors. And largely, those notices were issued for people moving in or out of the city during full lockdown that weren't necessarily engaged on an essential journey. I just thought that was quite an interesting piece of information in terms of the trends that we saw from an enforcement perspective. More recently, we've issued 3 notices for individuals that have failed to self-isolate, having returned to the UK from abroad. They were all issued in August of this year, and overall approximately 51% of the notices issued have been complied with, and that means that 49% are still going through the court process. So roughly half that have been challenged and are being taken through the court process. There are two particular issues that I wanted to discuss, one around licensed premises, which Jane's already touched on in terms of some of the negative media coverage we saw in relation to York and St Sampson's Square. I won't go over everything that Jane said, but just from my perspective, very, very grateful to partners for the way in which we responded to that, which was very quickly to put plans in place to engage with licensees and buskers and a whole host of other partners to make sure we didn't find ourselves in a repeat scenario of that particular situation. The other issue that I think members have raised concerns about is in relation to antisocial vehicle use and reports of speeding within communities. So again, I've brought some information in relation to those issues which might be helpful. So during lockdown, we saw quieter roads across the city of York and North Yorkshire, but faster speeds. And it's relevant to us in this forum because the A64 was a particular hotspot. So in late April, early May, we were recording speeds of 130 miles an hour plus most days on the road network. That's single and dual carriageway, not motorways. But I think that is really important to illustrate the point that we usually only see speeds that high on a weekend, certainly not on a daily basis. So for us to report 130 miles an hour most days was a significant change in driver behaviour for us. That was combated using a media campaign to highlight the dangers. We clearly wanted to protect the NHS and reduce demand. So people that were driving safely would obviously result in less collisions and less casualties, and highlighted quite publicly some of the speeds that we captured and the enforcement activity that was taking place. We've also had a number of joint operations between neighbourhood policing teams, the safety camera vans and the road policing department as well in order to combat that issue. And I think as we move forward now towards another lockdown, whilst we're still waiting to understand the finer details and the implications for policing, it's fair to say that clear, consistent comms will be absolutely key across all organisations. I think picking up on Matt's point, we're in a much stronger position this time because we've been through it previously. So I think we have a good understanding of what that might look like, and also an opportunity for us to work together much more collaboratively as we go into this second lockdown. And also just to reassure members, we are planning for Christmas, for New Year's Eve and beyond, and have resources in place appropriately for that. I'm always happy to scale those down if we need to, but actually getting those resources into place early on is absolutely key. And obviously then we can change those plans as we move closer towards those dates and understand what that will look like. And I think, Chair, that's it from myself. As I said, more than happy to take any questions.
Okay, thank you, Lindsay, and thank you everyone for giving us an update. And it's particularly been good to hear how, I know you were working together before COVID started, but it's particularly pleasing to hear that in some ways that those foundations have been built on and you've sort of taken the opportunity to do even more of it. So there's a lot to go out there. So I'll open it up to members to explore anything you've heard that you want to explore further, or perhaps anything you haven't heard that you want to ask questions on. Start with Councillor Musson.
Thanks, Chair. I wanted to ask about county lines, about any changes in the situation from the last update that we had, and of any challenges during this period that you've had to deal with it because of the regulations, or has it become more apparent, less apparent? I know someone's already commented on people becoming more sensitive to some things, and I think I wouldn't necessarily describe it as that in this situation, but I think when you've got no escape from situations like this happening on your street, it would certainly make me more sensitive to something like that.
Okay, who'd like to pick that one up? Lindsay.
Yeah, answer that one, Chair. I think just to go back to the very early stages of the initial lockdown, we did see a significant reduction in demand, which included county lines. As the restrictions eased, we started to see more of our typical business start to come through, and I would include county lines within that. I think what's been helpful is that we have had people that are at home much more than they would be normally and are able to report and provide information and intelligence, perhaps in a way that they wouldn't ordinarily do because they were out of the property at work, etc. So from an enforcement perspective, that's been really helpful in terms of gathering that information, and I would absolutely encourage people to continue to do that. either using 101 or if they'd like to do so anonymously through Crime Stoppers. But I think to answer Councillor Musson's question, we are probably back to pre-lockdown demand in relation to county lines, and it's absolutely a priority for my team.
Okay. Are there any follow-ups on that particular issue? Councillor Pavlovic.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you everybody for what I thought were really excellent and informative presentations. I suppose, Lindsay, just on the topic of county lines and drug-related offending, has lockdown seen any changes in your experience of acquisitive drug-related crime? Because I'm getting the impression that there was less, obviously, city centre acquisitive crime, shoplifting, etc., because there were no shops open. But there were still people that had addiction issues. So did we see that moving out of the city centre and into residential areas?
Not that I'm aware of, and certainly not that I would have confidence to be able to talk to in this forum. We saw a significant decrease in all crime types across all areas. So yes, I'm responsible for the city, but I've also got the wider York and Selby areas, and we saw the same trend actually across both districts. And then that steady increase again across all areas. So no, I can't say with any certainty that the closure of retail premises displaced crime to other areas, because the trends were very similar.
That's interesting.
Any follow-ups on on that one? Don't know if Councillor Pavlovic, you want to ask the question you had your hand up for.
Yeah. I'd just like to get some clarity on the courts. We heard all three council officers talking about the courts being closed. Lindsay talking about the courts being open and people going through the courts. Are you talking about two different types of court settings? Are you talking about the county, the enforcement courts, and Lindsay's talking about the criminal courts? And are courts for civil matters up and running yet?
Okay, who'd like to have a go at that? Rachel.
Oh, Rachel.
Thank you. Sorry, Rachel Antonelli from City of York Council.
The courts always have been open, both the magistrates and the county court. However, when lockdown started, they limited the type of cases that could be brought. So they were making sure that they were dealing with just the most urgent and important matters. There was also, in terms of the civil courts and housing and possessions, there was a ban on evictions, but that meant that ban was effectively a ban on possession orders of any kind. So anything that was already in the court system when lockdown started, that was all paused. No new proceedings could be brought because they weren't seen as urgent priority cases at that time. My understanding in terms of the enforcement of council matters, which are prosecutions, so anything that would be perhaps Matt's domain or Jane's neighbourhood enforcement officer's domain, the magistrates court is slowly opening up to those kinds of matters now. They're dealing with them in a priority order, so the matters that really are starting to become time limited, time critical are being dealt with, but we've got officers, lawyers in the council who are now attending magistrates court hearings. In terms of the county court, we have virtual hearings. York County Court is open. From a civil point of view, York has opened a Nightingale court, so they've got a backup county court as well because there's a backlog. The landscape for possessions has changed a little bit since we've entered into Tier 2. because bailiffs, in order to execute warrants, need to be able to enter houses. Now we're in tier 2, that's not possible, so they've been advised by the government not to actually execute any warrants. The courts are very much still open in terms of us progressing cases, so we've got cases where evictions were being set up, but we were able to do work behind the scenes, so we can work up a case to a final hearing. Doesn't necessarily mean an eviction. And when I say eviction and possessions, I'm talking about just antisocial behaviour cases. The rent cases at the moment, certainly in York, there's no movement on any of those cases at this current time. The other thing the government have done is they've said that there'll be effectively a moratorium during the month of December on any evictions and bailiffs taking any kind of enforcement action. In York, we've had that moratorium for a number of years. So during the month of December, the bailiffs at York County Court do not execute any warrants, so no one is evicted. So that's not going to really, we're not going to see any kind of additional impact in the city during the month of December. It's something that's always been a local agreement for many, many years across York. So I don't know if that assists members.
It does. Councillor Mason's got a supplementary. I'll let him go first.
Okay, Councillor Mason.
It's a declaration of interest and then hopefully a bit of an update. But as a magistrate, I thought I'd best say something because the courts are definitely open. They've had my time. And Lindsay might add this actually, but we're actually holding extra police courts on a weekend in York where the police are actually prosecuting themselves to try and get through some of the backlog. So it was just to add that there's a huge effort going on of all different things to try and speed things up.
Okay, thank you for that helpful clarification. Back to Councillor Pavlovic.
Thanks, Rachel. That was a really helpful answer. I suppose my question then is, given that there are these difficulties that are arising, when we're talking about cases that have been escalated to such a point that you're looking at an eviction, there's been a number of processes that have gone through, a number of warnings that have gone through before that it's reached that stage. To have reached that stage, the council have had to have made a decision that either the behaviour or given that we're talking about antisocial behaviour, has become so significant that only an eviction, only court enforcement would be appropriate. If then we're saying no, these individuals have to stay where they are, what is being done by both the police and enforcement to protect those neighbourhoods? Because presumably, just because there's court action being taken, doesn't mean that the behaviour's then been modified.
I don't know if Dennis or Lindsay want to, or Jane for that matter, want to say anything about, I suppose, managing that issue where a household can't necessarily be sort of removed from a situation, but there's then a situation that needs to be sort of managed as best it can. Who would like to offer an opinion on that? Jane.
So in those sorts of situations, we continue the multi-agency approach that we've been operating throughout this whole COVID situation. So we would be engaging our partners in regular meetings. At times we've held those meetings on a fortnightly basis, depending on the speed at which a case is moving or the severity of the incidents that are occurring. We would look at all aspects of the case. So where there were individuals with complex mental health or other support needs, we would be looking at bringing in adult social care to those discussions, looking at children's social care in relation to any children involved, and also very much working with the local area coordinators. I know certainly throughout this situation, we've worked very, very closely with them in terms of being that conduit between some of the enforcement teams and the community, and helping people to understand the limitations that we're working under, because I can really sense sometimes the frustration that communities are feeling. It's not their fault the courts aren't open. It's not their fault that they're having to continue to live in circumstances which are far from ideal. But we are working obviously with all of our partners to try and make sure that we put as much support in as we can for those individuals. And I think the important thing for me is around managing the expectations of communities and getting that message across, exactly what we can and cannot do at the current time, because sometimes it doesn't appear to be fair, but our hands are tied because we can't actually take action that we would normally be taking. The conversations that take place constantly between myself and the two neighbourhood policing inspectors. So we're talking all the time about everything that's going on, and that's not just about the individuals that are involved in a specific case. It's about the impact that that case is having on the wider community and what we need to do to try and put things in place. Where we can do, we will go and provide some reassurance visits to individuals. Now, our hands are tied again really with lockdown and not being able to go out and do that sort of work. But again, during lockdown, we had instances where it was quite clear that the community were not necessarily cited on what partners were doing to address the situation in their area. So we wrote to everybody within that street and let them know what was going on. So it's about, I think, we learned an awful lot in the last lockdown. We'll build on that again as we go into this second lockdown. And for me, one of the absolutely crucial things in all of this is communication, and making sure that as we do get clarity around rules and regulations, as we do understand the constraints that all partners are working under, because we're all working within different parameters and different rules, that we're communicating those issues to the community and making sure that they fully understand that work is really going on to try and do everything we can to address problems, and we will continue to do that as we go forward.
Thanks, Jane. Just if I can briefly pick up on that with Lindsay, I know on the issue of communication, the police do quite a bit on social media in terms of highlighting issues or where the police have been active in a particular area. And I know from feedback from residents that gives people confidence and kind of reassurance that the police are aware of an issue and are doing something about it. Is that something you want to kind of build on or do more of in terms of that kind of proactive communication from the police side?
Yes, absolutely. So in relation to COVID legislation, especially, then we are reiterating some of the central messages, either through the National Police Chiefs Council or through the City of York and North Yorkshire Local Resilience Forum, and making sure that we've got those consistent messages in relation to some of the key public health messages. More locally in communities, I would always encourage my neighbourhood teams to tweet, to use Facebook, to use their social media accounts to engage with the public, to show that we really do understand some of the local issues and to highlight the work that we're doing to address them. So I think that the communication for me is on two levels. There's a central piece around some of the key messaging to help people understand the latest regulations and what's required from them. But then more locally, I think there is always going to be a role for the neighbourhood teams to show that they are approachable, that they are engaging with their communities, and that they're actively addressing the issues that are raised to them. And I think social media is a really good tool to be able to do that. So yeah, absolutely keen to continue with that work.
That's great, thank you. Councillor Baker, you've had your hand up for a while. I'll bring you in.
Thank you, Chair. So yeah, my question was on speeding. So it was interesting to hear your information, Lindsay, about the top speeds that were recorded. I mean, it's just sounds very nightmarish if you happen to be out on the roads during those times. But what we get on an almost daily basis in the city, 365 days a year, is reports of enforcement of the 20 zones and just dangerous driving, even if it's in streets that don't have 20 zones in our local communities. It's a top issue. And so I'm frequently replying to residents, trying to reassure them that various campaigns about 20's plenty and community speed watches and things do go on. So I just noticed recently that the Police and Crime Commissioner had also advertised a survey that was being done nationally in regards to a review of policing the roads that the government is doing to look at various enforcement options and how effective they are. So I just wondered whether you had any thoughts, or you were hoping for any particular outcomes from that review, and if you could say something a bit about where we are at really with enforcement of 20 and 30 zones, and if anything more can be done there.
Yes, absolutely. So in relation to the national survey, my plea would be for residents, key stakeholders, to complete that with their views, to make sure that there is an informed approach, an informed view of some of the issues within our communities. In relation to enforcement of 20 mile an hour and 30 mile an hour zones, as I'm sure you will appreciate, we need to put our resources where the demand is. So it's really, really important that members of our community report those issues through to us so that we can collate them and identify where those hotspots are or where there are issues. And so for yourself, if they're coming through to you as councillors, I would encourage you to link across with my neighbourhood policing teams and make sure that you're sharing that information. We have a process called 95 Alive where we feed our concerns in relation to particular roads, which then triggers a whole host of activity around speed monitoring, etc. So the starting point is for people to raise their concerns, whether that's directly with North Yorkshire Police, whether it's with yourselves as elected members, but my plea would be pleased to share that information across with us so that we can build that picture of where the problems are and then make sure that we can allocate our resources appropriately and most effectively to tackle some of those community concerns.
Any other follow-ups on on the road safety front? Just one issue that, in addition to speeding, as Councillor Baker raised, as more and more people have been cycling, and many of the people who've returned to the saddle have maybe had a number of years where they haven't been cycling, and I know from speaking to some people, they've been it's been liberating, but it has at times been quite frightening as well when either they're close passed by a car, or basically they're on the receiving end of some sort of fairly inconsiderate behaviour. And I'd flag that as something in terms of communication and awareness raising as well as speeding. There's something around considerate motoring as well, because that as we come out of lockdown, as we go back into lockdown, we need to try and retain the gains that have been made in terms of more people cycling, and there's that evidence that maybe that's going into reverse, which is a concern. But I'm sure if you had limitless resources, you could you could direct resource in that way, in that direction. But it's just to flag up it. It is an issue that I'm sure you're aware of, but more and more people are experiencing. Okay, got a couple more hands up. Yeah, no, thank you. Councillor Musson.
Hiya, yeah. It sort of links in a little bit with cycling, but it's more of a broad question. I suppose it's for Lindsay and Jane. But as we're going into a second lockdown and gyms are closing and we're moving into a situation where people are going to get, their wants a daily exercise or whatever, but where the days are so short that the sun sets at the end of the working day, it's certainly something that a couple of people have mentioned to me, that actually we're going to have people experiencing this lockdown quite differently, because for particularly, let's say, women who are planning to exercise at night because they have no other choice, because that's the time of day they're able to get out. I think personal safety is going to be a big concern, because people have mentioned that the safety aspect of cycling, which gets worse obviously at night, even if you do your due diligence and wear all the high vis and lights in the world, it feels quite dangerous at the moment, to be honest, as a cyclist on the roads. And people who are out walking or out jogging in the dark, I think are going to feel a little bit on edge. It's quite unpleasant, to be honest, to be in a position where you feel like when you leave the house, that's your escape from the house, but actually you don't feel that safe leaving the house. So I think it's quite a tricky time in terms of people feeling safe. I don't know, that's just something that people have raised with me. So I think anything we can do to make people feel safer when they do exercise their freedom once a day or however many times would be great.
Yeah. I don't know if Jane or Lindsay want to come in on that, and I suppose it's compounded by the fact that I know I'm speaking to people who used to go out running as a group, but now you can't because you can only go out with one other person, so it just compounds it. Jane.
Yeah, so this is something which is particularly dear to my heart, because when I'm not being head of community safety, I'm also a fitness instructor. So, so I've had some thoughts around this for some time, and indeed I've seen quite a lot on social media of concern. So it's something, you know, obviously one of the other sides to community safety is I manage the Safe York Partnership social media feeds and the website. So it's something that I will be looking at, particularly as I'm sort of conscious that people will be looking to go and exercise outdoors. So providing that, you know, just general personal safety advice that we would always be providing in relation to doing these things in as safe a way as possible, and making sure that people are visible and that they've got, you know, mobile phone with them and all of those things that we would want to get across. So I'm on it. So thank you for raising it.
Thank you, Jane. I'll bring in Councillor Mason, then Councillor Pavlovic. Councillor Mason.
Thanks. A few observations. Obviously, most of my experience has been with licensing, and actually it's been really impressive to see the small businesses particularly be so good at how they've managed things and put a lot of money and effort into it. And I went out with the police licensing officer and the council's licensing manager the day of the pub's reopening, and you know, they only got the actual official regulations or the guidance I think the day before. So I think, you know, we should be really proud of what our city did do in terms of the best bits. But I think we've heard a lot about the city and the city centre, and one of my big concerns was during the kind of coming out of lockdown period, maybe kind of July, we were getting a lot of antisocial behaviour, especially in rural parts of our ward, kind of up near the college on those fields. I just wondered, maybe one for you, Lindsay, about what resources were put into kind of community policing opposed to what was going on in the city.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really important to say neighbourhood policing footprint remained throughout, and each of those teams had their respective patrol plans which focused on areas of concern within their community. So as you've alluded to, Councillor Mason, the fields near the college were a key part of the patrol plan for the outer team. The city was predominantly policed by the neighbourhood policing team and the city task force. So that's the team that haven't been in operation for that long, but certainly hit the ground running when COVID hit in terms of some of the support and enforcement around individuals within the city centre. So that's been brilliant for me as an addition to my resources, because it's meant that my outer MPT teams, everybody except those in the city, could absolutely focus on some of the residential areas and the outlying villages. So yeah, just some reassurance from me, that that's remained largely untouched.
Brilliant. And I presume as we go forward, that's still the case?
Yes, absolutely.
Brill. I know another thing, and I'm not sure, it's something that Matt informed me today of some test purchasing where we've had actually some really poor results around young people being served alcohol. And I just wondered if you're seeing anything like that in terms of what's coming out in terms of community intelligence of kids getting alcohol and causing trouble. I know again in Woodthorpe we've seen a lot of antisocial behaviour, and even someone smashing up all the pumpkins the other night before Halloween, which was, you know, disappointing. I just wondered if you're seeing that coming through in terms of those reports.
There's certainly nothing coming through in volume that's been escalated through to myself, but more than happy to go away and have a look at that in a little bit more detail. But it's certainly not something that my teams are reporting on a daily basis through our management meeting structures. But I'll have a chat with the relevant neighbourhood teams and check in on that for you if that would be helpful.
Yeah, I think it was disappointing to get those results, and I think especially now when like we're saying around drugs and things like that, people are looking for an escape, and if they're getting their hands on alcohol, then it doesn't end well always, and again puts pressure on the NHS.
Yeah, no problem.
Thank you for that. Councillor Pavlovic.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. And just to echo Councillor Mason's point, certainly within my ward, there has been a significant increase of certainly reports to us of young people under the age of 18 being able to access alcohol and behaving in a very antisocial way in parts of the ward. So anything that could be done from a community perspective in being visible, particularly in the evenings, when, as Councillor Musson has pointed out, people are feeling less safe because it's darker. They're feeling less comfortable about being on their own, particularly with exercising. So, I think that element of high visibility behaviour and addressing that would be very helpful. And to be honest, my question is almost a side question, but related to that, and it's about what happens over Christmas. Lindsay's mentioned that you're all going to be geared up for Christmas and the New Year period. From an enforcement perspective, Matt, we've had another month's lockdown going up until the 2nd of December. People are going to want to go out and celebrate, not potentially socially distancing. How big a challenge do you see city centre pubs being, all other things being equal, and we don't go into a lockdown, another over Christmas period? And from a policing perspective, will it be more of a softly approach, or will you have to be more sort of interventionist if people are not socially distancing in licensed premises?
Matt?
Yeah, shall I go first?
Please.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor. It's definitely something we're going to need to be prepared for. We'll be talking to licensees at the appropriate time about their responsibilities. I guess some of it will depend which tier we go back into, as well as to exactly what the restrictions will be when we get to that position. But let's remember that by and large, compliance is good, really good, and we've had that mentioned a couple of times. So that's a real positive thing, I think. Coupled with that, again, our response, I think, has been good. Working with the police, working with other partners, Jane's team and others, we've been able to put in resources in the right places at the right time, I think, and that's where we've seen, things that have flared up haven't continued. There've been flare-ups and they've largely died away. So I'm hopeful that if as and when the time comes, whether it's Christmas or whenever it is, I mean, I imagine that people will be quite excited about the opportunity of going out again. That whenever that is, we'll be able to provide an appropriate response, both in terms of education and ultimately enforcement as need be.
Okay. Councillor Baker, you've got a follow-up point to make.
Yeah, it was supplementary to Councillor Pavlovic's question, actually, because just as Councillor Mason and Councillor Pavlovic has said, they have had issues in their wards with the antisocial behaviour, and I know that another hotspot area, of course, is the Knavesmire, which covers a large area, and I'm sure draws a lot of different people to it, using it rightly or wrongly. So I don't want to ask specifically for updates on that, but just it made me think, you've given the figures, Lindsay, for the notices given for COVID enforcement, But just out of interest, have there been, what sort of numbers of community protection notices do you give out these days for antisocial behaviour? Have there been any of those issued at all across the city in the last 6 months?
I don't have that.
Whether that's a Lindsay or a Jane question about about notices, but I'll let Lindsay answer the second half of Councillor Pavlovic's question first, and then bring Jane in on the notice front. So I think Councillor Pavlovic was asking, whether you'd go in softly or otherwise, if we find ourselves in a post-second lockdown reopening of some description.
Yeah,
if you look in your crystal ball and tell us what you think might happen.
I wish I knew. I really did wish I had an answer for that one. I think, to be fair, for Councillor Pavlovic, we will follow the national direction. At the moment, that is that 4E approach that I've talked about already, with a focus very much on engagement and education, moving to enforcement as a last resort if required. Should that change in terms of that central direction to policing, then obviously I'll be in touch with members to advise and just make sure that everybody's aware in terms of our approach. But to be honest, I don't see a significant deviation from the way that we've been operating. And I think it will very much depend, as Matt has already alluded to, as to what that looks like post the 2nd of December, whether we do indeed come out of lockdown, and if so, if that's into a tiered system and the implications from there. But yeah, at the moment, the direction for us is very much to remain that focus on engagement and education.
Thank you. And Jane, if you can pick up the point that Councillor Baker made around any notices that might have been issued.
Yes, so community protection notices is our power. I can't give you the exact figures off the top of my head, but I can go away and look at them and circulate them at a later point. But in relation to actual notices, obviously that's something that would go through the courts. So community protection notices, I suspect we haven't issued any notices. However, as part of an escalating approach to enforcement, one of the biggest tools that we have is that escalation and that initial warning. And it's always our hope that people's behaviour changes on issuing that warning. So I do know that we have been issuing warning letters. We've issued a number of those for a whole range of antisocial behaviours that have occurred across the city throughout, right from the beginning of lockdown, right the way through, as a constant process. So we are still issuing warnings, and obviously those warnings will turn into notices if the behaviour persists. And as with everything else, we continue to build that case, gather that evidence, so that if we do need to progress to a notice, we can actually do that.
Okay, Councillor Pavlovic.
I've probably got the name of this wrong, but the police can also issue, is it a good behaviour contract or something, that can be issued to a householder that limits that excludes people from visiting that property, for example, other than the actual tenant. Is that something that's being used? I certainly am aware of it's being used in at least a couple of issues in my ward. But is that a tool that you find works?
Lindsay?
Thank you. So I think you're referring to an acceptable behaviour contract. Yeah, that would be one of the very first stages for us in terms of dealing with low-level reports of antisocial behaviour, and that's an agreement between the individual and it can be a number of different agencies in relation to what good behaviour would look like. That's really helpful in the escalation process. So we would always tend to use that as one of our first options. Again, it's all about engagement, isn't it, and education and informing individuals and giving them the opportunity to change their behaviour in the lowest possible level in terms of police intervention. But we would always do that with partners. And I think Jane's wanting to come in just in relation to that too.
Okay, Jane.
Yeah, so we have a joint approach to dealing with antisocial behaviour. So in the first instance, we would normally work with the neighbourhood policing team to look at an acceptable behaviour contract to try and change the behaviour. Changing the behaviour is what we really want to aim to be doing. We're not out to prosecute people. It's a last resort. If that then fails, then we would start to look at other tools and powers which would bring in things like community protection notices and at times criminal behaviour orders if there is criminality that's continuing and persisting in relation to that particular case. So we have an escalating approach. We work always in partnership. So everything that we're doing is we go hand in hand to use the most appropriate powers available to us, but always focusing first on that education and behaviour change before we move to enforcement.
Thanks, Jane. I've got a question for Matt. Matt mentioned COVID marshals, which I think that they sort of first came into sort of public consciousness probably about a couple of months ago, I think. Can you just explain a bit more sort of the mechanism through which they will be sort of established and deployed, and will they be a version of the bid rangers but citywide, or is it a city centre thing? But it sounds like a useful initiative. It'd just be helpful to know. Well, if you could tell us how much you know about about what might actually happen.
Yeah. Thank you. First of all, apologies if you can hear some background noise. My daughter's just decided this is a good idea to start a violin lesson. So
fair enough.
Apologies if you hear an awful racket. That's exactly what it is. Yeah, COVID support marshals. I, as I alluded to before, really excited about these. But basically, it feels like a long time ago, but that's the speed with which this coronavirus changes. It wasn't that long ago. It was only about 6 weeks or so ago. We got an announcement that there would be some money coming to help our efforts to encourage people to comply. So we've been in the throes of putting all that together, and the plan is, or at least the thinking is at this stage, is that there'll be a group of 6 or so people out there in the city centre, but wider as well, across the city, able to help people to comply with the COVID requirements. So that might be, having a gentle word with people, reminding people to space out. It might be saying to people, don't forget to put your face covering on. Potentially, we could even look to give the marshals some hand sanitizer to give people a squirt if they need it, or even some face coverings to hand out if people haven't got them. But they'll be able to go to places where there's queues, be that bus stops, taxi ranks, be it outside busy premises, just ensure people that are keeping their distance. We've seen a bit of it. It was around the 10 o'clock close time when there were queues forming outside of off licenses and shops in the city centre, where the people would just be able to give a helpful reminder to keep that distance and help ensure things are all in order. The other thing I'd really like to see them do, so that there's a very visible and helpful approach, is to have a kit to be able to just wipe down the cycle racks, to wipe down the buttons on the pedestrian crossing, other places that people are in frequent contact with, just so that they can see that there are people out there being really very helpful to try and get this R rate down, which is of course the key to all of this. So yeah, so it's very it's not an enforcement role. It's very much helping people to comply in absolutely desperate or in emergency situations. If they see, for example, in a pub, people are pulling tables together, or if they see that there are groups of larger than 6 congregating, then in that instance they will have the ability to intervene and say, come on, we need to do something about this and get this sorted out. And they'll refer it back either to our team or to the police, wherever it's appropriate, to pick up accordingly. But as I say, it is very much about encouraging compliance rather than enforcing.
Okay. So who would have kind of oversight of the COVID marshals? Would they be a CYC
Yeah.
force or? Yeah.
Yes, it's Anthony Dean in public protection who has been earmarked with managing them.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'm looking around for some blue hands. If not, I'll ask another question. It's one to Dennis about. It was mentioned earlier on about tolerance or lack of, and some of the issues that then spawns. I just wondered if have we learned anything from the past few months in terms of sort of steps to encouraging better community cohesion, because often when it comes out into the open, and I know from my experience, I'm sure other members will have had similar experiences, if residents, neighbours had spoken to one another in advance of something escalating to the point of it becoming a complaint, then an accommodation could have been found. I just wondered what kind of observations you've seen, and any learning you think we can take from what's happened in terms of building better community relationships.
Absolutely. So again, we touched on it earlier. I think it's about acknowledging everybody as an individual and building a relationship with them, and understanding where they're coming from, and you know, recognizing that all of us have been affected by what's happened, and using some of the person-centered, strengths-based approaches that we're developing across the council, listening to people, making sure that we give clear messages out, and using some of the tools which are on the softer side, so mediations, where appropriate, the acceptable behaviour contracts, which involves getting a discussion going, an agreement to do or not do something in a particular circumstance, talking through the consequences of particular behaviours with people, and obviously reminding them of the consequences of not applying with regulations or tenancy agreements, that sort of thing. And I think you're quite right. We've always encouraged people to self-help in that respect, to not be afraid to have a conversation with their neighbours, because more often than not that's quite successful, and it helps break down barriers and build up relationships. Not everybody finds that easy. We acknowledge that, and sometimes we're made aware of situations when it's gone beyond that being comfortable for people as well, and obviously we'll help and support people in that sense. And again, reassuring individuals and families that if things do escalate, that we are all here to help and support and make the interventions that we can, and being clear about what those interventions are in the current climate, and some of the long-term things that we could do, like building up evidence and cases for times when we may well be in a position to take more formal action. But actually, I think it's reinforced the learning, the journey that we were on around working with teams like local area coordination, and finding out what some of the underlying issues are to some of the behaviours that are displayed, which can cause problems within blocks of flats, communities, that sort of thing, and trying to address those rather than trying to enforce our way out of things. It's more time consuming. It is about relationships. It's hard work, really, really hard work, but actually the results can be so much more effective in the longer run.
No, thank you for that. And just to I suppose, to know the work that I know a lot of housing management officers do to oversee and engineer those kind of conversations and try and understand the issues, rather than marching in, sending someone a letter saying, we understand you're doing this, please stop it. sort of trying to understand the big picture, and I know that has been successful in a number of instances. So I think that certainly I'm very grateful for the work that they do. Got a couple of hands up. Councillor Pavlovic.
Thank you, Chair. This is a question for Lindsay, really. As an essential service, as key workers, I suspect the police don't often get the same thanks and recognition that, for example, the NHS have had. But I just wondered how your teams have managed to cope, because you don't have the luxury of working from home. So, two officers rang my doorbell at 2:45 in the morning the other day because somebody had reported a crime on the street, and although they were in masks and face masks, they are face to face with the public day in, day out. How's that impacting on your staffing numbers and just a huge thank you for the work that they've been doing.
Lindsay.
Oh, thank you, that's really appreciated. I think it's fair to say that since the start of the pandemic, we have worked really, really hard to keep our frontline safe, and that has meant that where we have staff and officers that are able to work from home, we have absolutely encouraged them to do so, because actually, should we have an outbreak on one of our response bands, we'll need to be able to resource that from elsewhere. I think it's also fair to say that as time has gone on, we have seen more and more the impact of the requirement for officers to self-isolate, particularly as a result of test and trace implications. But also we're seeing more and more staff and officers testing positive with COVID as well. So that's not to alarm people, it's not huge numbers, but it is very much having an impact, particularly where you see a large number of staff from one shift having to isolate. That clearly has some implications in terms of how we resource, and that's where our plans have really come in terms of encouraging people to work from home, because we can then bring them into the workplace to replace those officers that perhaps need to isolate or have indeed tested positive. So yeah, you absolutely will see officers and staff wearing masks when they're out and about, when they're in the vehicles, adhering to social distancing, and that's exactly what we need them to do. But you're really right, Councillor Pavlovic, that for some of those people there has been very little respite since March, and I think it's fair to say that we have staff and officers that are very much feeling the effects of that. So we're really grateful for your thanks. I'll make sure that's passed on.
Yeah. Councillor Pavlovic.
Certainly, yes, certainly heartfelt. And so what is in place to support those hard-pressed staff that really are, I suspect, feeling the pressure of a constant 9 months and reductions in staff, reductions in rest days? I don't know whether it has actually impacted on the amount of rest days that staff are having, but are there support packages that have been put in, additional support packages that are over and above what would be there normally?
Yes, absolutely. One of our first measures was to actually encourage our teams to take leave. So what we saw, particularly as the restrictions went on for longer, is that people were cancelling their annual leave because they weren't able to take their foreign holidays, for example. So we stood really firm in encouraging our staff to have some time off and a break away from the office, and particularly those frontline response duties. In addition, and without going into loads and loads of detail, there's obviously a number of processes internally to support people accepting that everybody's experience of lockdown and the restrictions is very different, and how people were feeling back in March will obviously change over time, and understandably so. So there is now an offer of an individual risk assessment with their line manager to talk through their individual requirements, any additional support that they might need, and just to make sure that we have that mechanism for a very open and honest conversation around how people are feeling and how we can best support them.
Thanks, Jane. Councillor Mason.
Thanks. It's another housing one, Dennis. Although nothing's been announced about, or I haven't seen anything been announced about emergency accommodation and use of hotels and things like that, the skeptic in me thinks that we're going to be locked down for more than we're told, and I just wondered what the long-term implications of that might be. I mean, obviously, even though I'm sure some people still didn't come in during that period, it was obviously much finer weather, and obviously we're going into our busy period when we have all the emergency accommodation available and below zero stuff. I just wondered if you think anything might come, and or what else we're doing about it.
Dennis?
Yes, I think we're scheduled for a formal update at our next scrutiny meeting, which will no doubt be 2 days before Christmas, as it was last year.
Three.
3 days, all right. But what I can tell you in the meantime is that the everybody in exercise, which I think you're alluding to, has never really gone away. So we still have to comply with all the social distancing. We still have a requirement to take people in. And there are a couple of individuals who have returned to the streets of their own volition. It's not because we haven't got capacity to take people in. Those are personal choices. We will keep offering them accommodation and alternative solutions within the range that we have available. We're in the extremely lucky position in that we've got our brand new hostel, James House, which is full. But we have capacity in some of the buildings that we previously used as hostels, some of which are in the longer term, medium to long term, are going to go for redevelopment and some for sale. But we have them at the moment, and we're actually using Ordnance Lane, for example, as a triage setup, and plans are to use that for winter provision, any increased winter provision. The teams are working extremely hard to keep numbers as low as possible. I can't say anything now, but we have had our annual formal street count, and I was hoping to be in a position to confirm numbers, but we haven't had sign off from government as yet. Hopefully that will happen over the next day or two, hopefully everybody will be encouraged when that's confirmed, with the work that the teams have done and the impact that's had. So yes, we have capacity. We're planning. We are in a good position. As I've mentioned, all of the rules that applied under everybody in, and the social distancing, and making sure that staff are following the COVID secure approaches that we've developed, all in place. So I'm confident that unless we see an exceptional surge, and we're monitoring all of the signs closely, obviously as has been mentioned, the ability to take legal action is back in place, but there are much longer timescales on that. We're monitoring the position closely, particularly in the private rented sector. We're not seeing any big changes at the moment, and we're planning to do some work around the private rented sector, a very difficult sector to intervene in any meaningful way, because it is so disparate, and the actual numbers are unknown in totals. But we intend to do what we can in the meantime as well to minimise the impact on not only rough sleeping, but our homelessness services as well in its entirety.
Okay, thanks, Dennis. And as you mentioned, we'll be giving that issue a good airing at our next meeting. But thanks for the for the heads up. Okay, thank you everybody for your contributions. I'll just lastly go around our speakers, I suppose, for any sort of final thoughts or observations or suggestions as to what we as members or the wider public, what we can do to help you over the next few weeks and months. I'll start with Lindsay, if I may.
Thank you, Chair. I think the plea from me is just for people to adhere to the regulations, as you would expect me to say. They're there to prevent the spread of the virus and to keep people safe, and that's our role in terms of any education, engagement and enforcement. So plea from me would be for people please to adhere to the lockdown restrictions.
Thank you. Jane, any pleas from you?
Yes, I think I'd echo what Lindsay has said, but I think I would also once again encourage people to report concerns. It's that reporting that gives us the picture that we need to be able to put measures in place to address things. And time again, I hear anecdotal evidence that things are happening on the streets, but it's not being reflected in reported incidents. And without that information coming in, it makes it very difficult for the team to get on top of things and address them. So again, I would urge that people do report things, and we will do our best to address them.
So that's just so everyone watching is clear. So where it's either antisocial behaviour or other similar concerns, it's 101 as the main conduit through.
Yes, it's 101, or and if it's noise related, directly to my team on 551555.
Excellent. Matt, you're next. Any
pleas
from you?
Yeah, again, I would echo that reporting. To keep the information coming in. I know there's various different routes, but to be honest, if you report it through to any of those routes, it will find its way through to the right place. We are working together on this, so please keep telling us about your experiences.
Neil, raise your hand. Do you want to come in?
Yeah, just on that final ask of members really and the public out there is, I'm picking up a point that Matt's been making all evening really, really celebrate the quality of response from our local businesses in the hospitality and Republican sector, and when the city does reopen, please use those businesses, because we have got some fantastic businesses that have been very responsible, and broadly speaking, the people of York have done a fantastic response in terms of their listening to national advice and listening to our officers and listening to the businesses that have hopefully facilitated some good nights out, even though we've had a really difficult summer. And that would be my ask.
Yeah. Thank you. Last but not least, Dennis. Any pleas from you?
Yeah, I'd just echo what everybody else has said, but just to be mindful that it is about reducing our number, getting it down. So let's encourage each other in as friendly and approachable manner as possible, and just to recognise that quite often the regulations don't cover absolutely every eventuality. What we found is that everybody seems to have an opinion on some of the regulations that aren't quite clear. So the underlying message is about what can we do to get the R rate down, get back to normal, be able to get out and access those businesses and do the things that we all enjoy again.
Wise words. Thank you very much, Dennis, and everyone for that discussion. It was really helpful. So now I learned a lot about the work that's been going on. So thank you for all you have done and all you are about to do over the next few weeks. Okay, so move on to the next agenda item, which is agenda item 5, which is the work plan. So at our informal meeting on the 20th of October, which I have to confess I have not yet typed up the minutes from, but I will do, we sort of reinforced our desire to continue with the work we had started back in March on the scrutiny topic of affordable housing on private developments, and we identified some areas where we wanted to make a particular focus with a view to actually using that piece of work to hopefully drive policy development. So I fed that through to a meeting. There was a meeting of scrutiny chairs last week. So I inputted into that meeting the outputs of our discussion and CSMC Corporate and Scrutiny Management Committee is pulling together a very impressive spreadsheet. Councillor Crawshaw's working with democracy officers to pull together a big spreadsheet with lots of things on it, which will hopefully guide our work over the next few months. So I think at our next meeting, if we bring a paper with the output of that work, so we've got a sense of what we'll be working on. But I think in the meantime, when I circulate the notes from our previous discussion, if we can agree on the focus for the affordable housing on private developments work, we can be getting on with that. There's no reason why we can't follow the lines of inquiry we've identified, and certainly from the engagement we had with officers, there's certainly an eagerness and a willingness to support us in that from the discussions we've had with Andrew Bebbington and his colleagues. So we can get cracking with that. Tracy Carter, you want to come in there?
Yes, please. I'm just noting from the minutes of your previous meeting, you identified the retrofitting of sustainability measures on council housing as a topic that you wanted to give some consideration to. And there is a report being drafted to come forward to a December executive. And I wondered whether the committee would consider doing a piece of pre-decision scrutiny on that particular topic as that report goes through.
Members? Okay, I'm getting nods. Yes, sorry, Lindsay. Thank you, Lindsay. You're free to go. Thank you for joining us. Thank you. So I think that's a yes. I suppose the issue is then finding a date for that meeting that allows us to consider it, and then for our views to inform what goes to executive. So maybe you and I and a democracy officer can liaise offline, and we can sort something out. No, that's really helpful. So I'll keep members informed as that prioritisation exercise with Councillor Crawshaw continues, and so we know where we stand in terms of our forward plan. Councillor Baker.
Thanks, Chair. I just wanted to comment on what Tracy said. Yeah, I think it's a great time to do it, actually, because people's engagement in wanting to make their houses warmer and more energy efficient is going to be right at the top of more people's minds right now as we're going into colder weather. And also the fact that there's the Green Homes grant out for applications at the moment, and that's very short time limited. So I just think it is going to be a good time to be able to publicise work on this and find out more about how we can help people to understand about the importance of retrofitting. So yeah, it's a good one.
Okay. Anything else anybody wants to raise on work plan? Nope. So sorry, Councillor Baker again.
Yes, sorry, I did have another point. We had on a previous agenda another update from Ruth Abbott about enforcement of licensing in private rented sector. So I just wondered if that had still made it onto the priority list. Is that still coming along?
So we identified extension of HMO licensing as a potential topics. I think the feedback from officers was that time permitting, they would welcome our involvement in their work to building a sort of a case for that. So that's, yeah, that was on our long list. And I think, you know, the more we can do that actually informs future policy development is a good thing. So yeah, that's all in there. Okay, if there's nothing else on work plan, item 6, urgent business. I am not aware of any urgent business, in which case I shall declare the meeting closed and wish you all a good evening. Thank you, everyone. Good night.
Thank you.
Confirm the live stream's now finished.